Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Maryland Risk Management Education Podcast. My name is Paul Geringer, and I'm the Extension Legal Specialist here in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Justin Benavidez and Dr. Charley Martinez. Justin is with Texas A&M University. He's a regional economist with them, and Charley is a professor and extension economist with University of Tennessee. So they will be talking today about some of the ongoing issues that we've been seeing in the news here lately, with concerns that there's limited competition within the beef markets and some of the other protein markets. We've mainly focused in on the beef markets with this one. Working to get a lawyer on to talk about the legal issues associated with all of this as well, but I will turn it over to the previously recorded episode. Charley and Justin, why don't you give us a little bit about your backgrounds and what you do at University of Tennessee and Texas A&M? And I don't know who wants to start us off.
Sure.
Justin, you go first.
Okay, that'll work. Well, my name is Justin Benavidez. I'm an agricultural economist at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. I got a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in agricultural economics at Texas A&M, and then they swindled me into staying even longer, so I went to work for AgriLife. I'm originally from Tulia, Texas, which is not far from where I work now. I'm the economist for District 1, which is the Texas Panhandle. And for those who don't know, that's the square part up at the top. And we have probably the highest density of fed cattle in the world in my district, as well as a lot of row crops. And we study a lot of water issues. So it's a really fascinating place to work. And it's been really interesting. We're here at about approaching 2 years now.
So I'm Charley Martinez. I work with the University of Tennessee, and I am an ag economist, also with Extension. So technically, my title is farm and financial management specialist, and I do research. I have a research appointment too, and kind of similar to JB. I grew up in Texas, but I got my undergrad at A&amp Kingsville, which is, if you ever heard of the King Ranch, that's where the university is in South Texas. I got my bachelor's in ag business, ranch management from there. And then from there, I got my PhD at Texas A&M. And I'm from Dallas area, that's where I grew up. So I've kind of lived all over the state. I did a couple of internships in the Panhandle where JB works currently. So just kind of lived all over the state of Texas, and now going on month 7 at Tennessee.
Okay. So the reason I had you guys on today was to talk a little bit about what's going on in the beef market. So what would normally happen in the beef markets if there wasn't a global pandemic going on? How would they normally operate? And what was kind of the outlook, if you want to talk about that, for this year pre-pandemic?
Sure. Charley, I'll start with this one and you can feed in kind of when we get to the how we start. Okay. So I think the really important thing to start with is the way the cattle market functions, not within a year necessarily, but where we were in what's called the cattle cycle. And so the cattle cycle is this pattern where over time the herd grows nationally and the herd shrinks nationally. And the number of cows that we have in the United States influences, obviously, the number of calves that we have in the United States. And so if you have an increasing number of calves and you have a stable demand for beef products, you would then expect the price of those calves to go down because, just going back to basic fundamentals of economics, when supply of something goes up and demand is stable, we would expect a falling price. And so that's kind of where we were for the last few years. The herd has been growing for a while, and so we've had more and more calves each year, and so the price each year has kind of fallen a little bit year over year. And we finally, at the beginning of 2020, reached what's called the peak of the cattle cycle. And so we were at this point where for the first time in January of 2020, we had fewer cows than in January of 2019. What that means then is this year we were expected to have the peak number of calves in the production system because calves born last year go into feedlots and packers this year. And so we were looking at peak beef production, which means pretty low prices for calves this year in general. And so that's kind of where the environment was before coronavirus kind of hit us. We were at the peak of the cattle cycle and low prices in general. The number of cows fell by about 1% this year compared to last year. So basically, long story short, we had a lot of cows, a lot of calves, which was leading us to already kind of depressed prices. And then, Charlie, go ahead.
Kind of piggyback off of that, I think this was the first year in 5 years that we had a decrease in numbers coming off the big drought of 2014. So I think JB's done an excellent job of trying to paint a picture as we were coming into the beginning of 2020. Sorry, I wanted to kind of highlight that we were growing quite a bit the last couple of years to rebound off of the drought.
Yeah, and we were at somewhere in the neighborhood of, just for reference, about 31 million beef cows in the United States in January. And there's another inventory report coming out in July that'll give us a mid-year update. But in general, big cow herd, which leads to low prices. And then spring in particular is a time when a lot of calves go on feed. And so there's a pretty good premium for calves in the spring. If you look at kind of medium to large calves in the 500 to 700 pound range, there's typically a seasonal premium. So you would expect maybe not the highest prices of the year every year, but pretty good support for prices during this part of the year. And, if you look at cattle outlooks for 2020 compared to the rest of, 2019 and the years before, we were expecting for, at least in my case, the fall cattle prices to start going back up. So calf prices in the fall increasing, maybe stable to slightly low prices during this part of the year and in the spring. But fall, kind of we were looking at a better picture than last year. That was, again, all pre-coronavirus.
And coming into it, as we're getting out of the first quarter, whenever the coronavirus really started taking its toll, not only on the beef industry, but on all industries, that's the time of the year where we start getting into grilling season for the beef side of things. And from a demand side, there was a strong demand. We've had growing demand for beef in the country, and so we had a high supply, high demand coming into 2020, and then as we started getting into the coronavirus, that's when everything just started doing stuff that's never been seen before.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess the other follow-up to that would be, and you may have already hit upon this, how has the pandemic really changed that outlook for 2020?
I can get on this one, JB, and then pick up whatever I don't hit on. So historically, in the springtime, especially here in Tennessee, for instance, I'll use Tennessee as an example, but it's the same pattern that occurred across the nation. Usually we'll get into March. That's when we'll sell our highest volume feeder calves from a producer standpoint. It occurs in March. Well, when we got to March and April, we had receipts down quite substantially in March and then also in April compared to the previous 5 years. And then when we compared it to the national averages and the national receipts, we saw the same patterns where producers saw that prices were not doing that great. And so instead of selling and just taking whatever the price that they had, they went ahead and said, okay, we'll hold on to these cattle. And so because of that, it's kind of altered the cattle supply, and it's kind of shifted it a little bit and kind of backlogged it in terms of, from a feeder standpoint, the calves that were normally being sold March and April were held, and luckily a lot of places had grass this spring, and so those cattle were held on longer, and now they're starting to trickle into the supply now. And so the effects are still being felt, especially in the cattle industry, just by nature of the cattle and the biological system, how long these things take to get an animal to the feed yard, and then from the feed yard to the packer. It's going to take a little bit longer, and it's kind of interesting that always a question is, well, how long are these effects going to last? It's going to be, we know what's happening, how long it's going to last. It depends on a number of different things. But for sure, as we work through the 2020, hopefully we can start catching back up in terms of the balance of supply and demand of the feeder calves.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing that was really interesting to watch, the structural way that coronavirus really impacted this industry in several different ways in sequence. So at first, if you look at prices, as Charlie said, right out of the gate. So I kind of think about when the NBA shut down as the beginning of coronavirus in the United States, right? So March, yeah, for sure. So March 11th or 12th is when it really began to hit. And if you look at prices right there, the price of live animals began to fall drastically. And that was a result of, as Charlie pointed out, some of the restructuring of the market. So people stopped eating as much out at restaurants. Even if you're still able to access food at a restaurant, it was takeout, and very few people were doing that. We were consuming a lot of beef at home instead of consuming it at the restaurant. So that really, for a short period of time, began to decrease the demand for beef or the demand for some cuts that were consumed in stores. And so prices for live animals fell a little bit as a result. We turn around then a few weeks later, and we had this run on grocery stores. And it wasn't just toilet paper anymore, right? We started seeing runs on, in particular, proteins, because there were rumors of food shortages. So then you look for a very brief time, about 3 or 4 weeks, we saw an increase in the value of live animals because as the increase in demand for beef really hit, they needed more live animals, and packers and feeders were beginning to start to schedule those animals to go through processing so that they could supply the increase in demand for beef. The third issue that finally hit that I think most people are well aware of was when coronavirus kind of hit packing plants. And we're going to talk about this a lot on this podcast, I'm sure, but this is where Charlie was talking about where the two industries meet, beef and cattle being, kind of two linked but separate industries. When packers were hit with this virus and they had to either shut down in some cases or use personal protective equipment, which slows the ability of a worker to do their job, we started seeing a decrease in the supply of beef, which pushed that price of beef way up from some of those same principles we talked about earlier. And it decreased the price of live animals because we had a lower demand for live animals because they just couldn't process as many. And we had a higher price for beef because not as much was coming out the back end. So it really hit in several different ways, this entire cattle and beef complex. And it's been an interesting, really dynamic kind of situation to watch. And I don't suspect many people have seen anything like it other than, Charlie, would you say probably the Holcomb fire last year was the closest?
That'd be the closest thing. But that was an internal, industry-specific type event that occurred for the beef industry, and I think that's minuscule compared to what's happened now, especially just because of, from an economy standpoint, people losing jobs, people not having to worry about just living, so it's a little, I don't think nothing's ever been seen like this.
Yeah.
And you both bring up good points, because when we had that backlog in poultry and pork, we were killing animals or depopulating animals that were ready to go to slaughter. And in beef, we can at least hold them off to the side and hopefully not lose quality as they're being held. But
yeah,
there's something. Is there? Oh,
yeah, the one big impact there, and Charlie knows more about the biology than I do, but you begin to see an increase in the size of these animals as they're held longer on feed. And so you'll have some quality impacts. If they're on feed longer, you're probably going to see grading higher. And we did see that for a short period of time. But Charlie, what are some of the other things you would think about growing the size of these animals because they're on feed longer?
Well, I think that's the biggest thing. Just being able to, as they work through this backlog, I think the ones that are coming in real light, they're probably going to keep them real light. And the ones in terms of cattle, when I say light, smaller weighted calves. And then I think the biggest thing that they were left with, that feeders were left with, was, okay, we know, as you mentioned, it was the prices are not exactly, in our favor right now because of the demand is decreased because the packers aren't demanding as much right now. And so they were kind of left with, okay, which ones do we send off to go get slaughtered versus which ones do we keep? And I think one of the biggest things that I saw in terms of just the addressed weight or kill weight that we were sending big, heavy weighted animals and saying, okay, if we're going to have to if we can send a very few, we're going to send the big ones because they're already we've already held them. If you think about it in terms of max weight, they're already at the max weight. We can't hold them if we wanted to. And so then the strategy from a feeding standpoint starts changing. And talking with some folks that are in the feeding side of things, depending upon the size of your feed yard, I think is going to give you different strategies. So for instance, if you're a small feed yard, you might think about renting out the space to a cow-calf producer instead of feeding out animals just because you reduce your risk that way. Whereas if you're a big one, 60,000 to 100,000 cap feed yard, your feeding strategy is going to be a lot different.
And going back to the Holcomb fire, because that kind of leads into question 4, because that's kind of where I thought this was coming up at times. I reheard it last year when that happened, and now we're hearing it again. There are these new concerns that packers are manipulating prices because we've seen lower animal prices, higher retail prices. Is this a concern? And, what should the average person be thinking about when they look at these arguments that there's price manipulation going on in the beef markets?
I'd say, so refer to the things Charlie and I have kind of mentioned already. These disruptions led to changes that we would have expected if you were doing an economics 101 course. Supply went down of beef, and sometimes it's a perception issue too, right? Like if there's a perceived decrease in the availability of beef, even if there's not really one, that's going to drive the price up because people are going to go and make a run on the store. Well, then there really was a shortage. And when we say shortage, we mean there was less available than the demand for it. The price really did run up. So, I mean, this is kind of what we would have expected. Now, I will say one thing that we learn in economic theory and training, modeling and all that stuff, direction is easy to predict. The change that we see in a direction is basically fundamentals of economic theory, and usually it's what most people would assume the direction change is going to be. Magnitude's much more difficult to predict. So answering whether or not there was some artificial increases there is something worth at least looking at and questioning, because interference in a free market is obviously a concern. And so you ask if there's concern. I think everyone should be an advocate for themselves, and advocating for yourself as a farmer or as a consumer here is not anything to scoff at. It's worth questioning. I don't know. It'll take some econometric modeling and some deep investigation to determine whether or not those prices were artificially.
A good economist question. Answer. It depends.
Yeah.
No, I think you talked about it or described exactly what we'd expect. And there's been other, if we go back to some of the literature in ag econ, there's been studies done by people such as Dr. Wade Brorsen, Dr. Ted Schroeder, Dr. Jason Lusk, where they look at the prices in the markets from that angle, and they've looked at it from the past, and it kind of says that there isn't. It's all about perception. Maybe if you're down the supply chain line, that's what you'd see. So I think it's a perception is the best way to look at it. As a cow-calf producer in my family, we look at prices and it's just like, oh man, they're not that great. And then I get questions by my own family. Why? What's happening? So it's like, well, here, think about it. There's a bigger picture here. And so I think Justin did a good job of describing it. Just kind of, it's all gonna be about perception, and kind of the direction that we expected is what happened. And it's especially like if you got to keep in mind, I think some people kind of say, okay, well, cash price is doing this, the futures is doing this, and the cutout value is at the biggest it's ever been, astronomically high for the cutout. We'll just say the choice cutout. The Packers got to be making money. Well, we don't know what costs are associated with those margins, and so we to make a assumption of saying that there's market manipulation, they knew what they're doing. I think that we can't say that because we don't know the cost structure. I think that's the biggest part of it, of what's happening in the packing plants. I know some packing plants were losing employees. They were paying extra and overtime. They had to go put out PPE equipment. And so that all has a cost to it. And then going back to the Holcomb fire, that puts a transportation constraint back on to the Packers of saying, okay, we got to redirect these fat cattle. Where do they go? And that's a cost. There's things that we can't see because of privacy reasons, but I think perception is the biggest key. And I think Justin did a good job highlighting that.
Yeah. And Charlie's done a really good job of pointing out cutout as a measure. The cutout to live margin is typically a good measure of what
it's the only measure.
For sure. It's the only one that's available. And it usually works. It's usually a good indicator of where profitability is for Packers. But in these weird circumstances, in this unusual time that we're living in, as Charlie said, there's been breakdowns in the structure of fixed costs, how many cows you're allocating those fixed costs over. And if you were shut down, it doesn't really matter if your margins were over $400 a hundredweight. You weren't making any money because you weren't processing any cows. So, I think all good points Charlie brought up. So asking, whether or not we think there's market manipulation, I don't really know. But always be an advocate for yourself. I think there's nothing wrong about asking those questions.
Investigations that have started, you've kind of already hinted that some of this is going to take econometric modeling that they're probably going to have to run. But, what do you think about those, and from y'all's perspective?
Yeah, I find them very interesting, particularly because some of the allegations come straight out of the Amarillo area. The allegations are market manipulation, price fixing, explicit price fixing. And I do find them very interesting. And I'll talk about the Amarillo perspective in general, because we are, at the heart of, if not one of the most important regions of cattle country. And in 2013, we had 4 major packing plants within about 150 miles of each other. 2 of those packing plants were owned by the same company. Cargill owned Friona, which, Charlie, you worked in Friona, yes?
I worked at the feed yard that was right down the road in Bovina. So, but I've been in Friona. Yeah. I've been around.
And so there was that plant, and then there was also a plant in a town called Plainview, Texas. And so at that point in time, as Charlie said earlier, and during the drought, we had a very restricted number of calves because we didn't have many cows, because we just didn't have any forage for them. And so at that point, 4 major packers were competing for a supply, and most of those, if not all of those packers, saw negative margins because they were paying a very high price for the very few calves that were there. And as a result, the plant in Plainview shut down because there just really weren't enough calves to go around. And allegations now are coming as far back as that market change, calling that part of the price fixing structure and some of the market manipulation that occurred. Well, so I would argue that is economic fundamentals driving us to that.
Yeah, no, I was going to throw in there just a quick fact about that Plainview plant. During that time, I was on a meat judging team, and we had just done our national championship there. And they had, that summer, before we had the national championship, they had renovated and added on to that plant. So keep in mind, they put more capital into this plant, and they end up shutting it down. So I don't think that's something that by me knowing that and kind of seeing that part, I think it's economic driving, not necessarily price fixing or, trying to corner the market per se. Because the Friona plant, for instance, is a little bit smaller, the capacity is smaller. So it's they shut down a bigger one. So it kind of made me, when I was younger, I was scratching my head going, why would you shut down one that was just redone, renovated, and everything else, and it had capacity added to it?
So it is very interesting all the way around, I think. And some of the allegations that came out recently, too, were an employee who worked, obviously the name is redacted. I don't know who any of these people are, but the allegation was that the packers here in this area were explicitly paying lower prices for live calves. And so, it's worth there being some sort of follow-up to an allegation like that, whether or not it comes out with an answer that is favorable for the packer or favorable for the producer, whatever favorable means. I would think the packer would have an incentive to know, to have it out there that they weren't price fixing. And if it came out that they were, that is something that the producer is obviously entitled to understand and know. I'm not as well versed, I'm sure, in the legal side of it as you are, Paul, but I think it's worth investigation, at least looking into it and asking those questions.
Yeah, and if we look at the poultry industry, we've already seen indictments made and some similar claims within poultry, which is different in how it operates compared to the beef industry. But we've already got indictments against at least one company and other claims. So yeah, I think it's worth investigating just to determine and maybe put an end to either one way or another.
Sure.
I see that, and that's the thing. It would be, it's interesting because it's like, okay, if it comes out that no, there isn't, then that allows us to have something to lean on to say, look, markets are working. It's just, again, what perspective do you have of the answer?
Yep. Yeah. And I'll steal a line from Charlie and I had the same advisor, and I'll steal, a thought from him too. It's worth thinking about the grocery industry in this as well, because we have Kroger and Walmart account for a huge portion of this country's grocery demand.
Largest grocery.
And
Walmart.
So also, asking about whether or not that duopoly or oligopoly, are there questions to be asked there? Because they have a lot of market power as well. And a lot of times people forget that, and that's directly stolen from David Anderson. But it's a good thought, and again, worth just asking those questions.
That's a good point. Yeah, I fully agree with kind of the sentiment behind that. So any other thoughts you want to put in on this topic, or things we haven't talked about? Or
I think it's right now we've just gotten some of the reports back. We'll get a mid-year inventory here in July, and I think about, I guess, May, whenever it really started hitting the fan, and the infamous David Anderson was appearing on all these national shows, and we're finally now being able to get a chance to digest of some of the stuff that's happened. And whereas like the pork and the poultry industry can adjust their supply and they have a lot more flexibility in terms of adjusting to something like this, the beef industry, I mean, the animals that were getting that were the fat cattle during the heart of everything happening in May and June, those animals were roughly 18 to 24 months old. And so those animals, when there's the biology of the beef industry, of just the cow itself, before from being born until it's going to the packing plant, takes a lot of time. And so knowing that we're just now starting to be able to see to digest some of the things that have happened, I think the biggest thing is that the beef industry is going to still have lingering effects. And who knows how long that's going to be. If someone knows how long it's going to last, that's $1 million question. And I know, for instance, they're packing more on Saturdays. Saturday production has picked up. We're starting to hit some of the inventory in terms of cattle on feed. And so the inventory report, the mid-year, that will be a really good indication as to how fast we can rebound from what's happening. And I guess kind of a benefit to everything is that as we mentioned, coming into 2021, we were going to have a lower supply of feeder calves available. And so since we're going to have lower feeder cattle available, that might allow us to catch up quicker. Whereas if we were still growing as a national herd, for instance, we would have a big supply of feeder calves that still need to be moved. And therefore the effects would still be lingering. The lingering effects would be longer in terms of time. So it might be a beneficial thing that we didn't have, that our supply is lower this year. And so therefore that kind of can help us in finding a floor in the prices. But I think the biggest thing is hopefully this thing doesn't last, 3-4 years. Hopefully it's only 2 years tops in terms of lingering and feeling some of the effects, because people now that we're having calves this spring, they go to sell this fall. Are they going to hold on to them longer again, or are they going to go ahead and sell in the fall? It's going to be kind of those types of questions. And I think if you're a producer, any kind of profit margin that you can find or anything that helps your profit margin, such as castrating or doing some kind of value-added program like a back 45, I think that's real beneficial in terms of trying to find value now, because prices might not be that great because of what's happened. So try to find any kind of value you can is like the biggest things that I'm taking away from what's happened in the beef industry.
And Charlie gave me a perfect segue there with the value added. I think this is a classic case of make sure you have a risk management plan in place. Whether or not you have those calves contracted ahead of time, whether you're in the futures market, you have LRP, make sure you're not overstocked and have to feed suddenly these calves a lot longer than you originally planned on. I think this is a classic case study of have a plan in place for your risk management strategy and follow that plan, because the people who had a futures contract on their calves or against their calves when this all hit actually came out of this pretty well, making some significant profits in both the futures market that offset their losses in any calves, and in some cases made money on the calves and made money on the futures market. So classic case study of risk management that I think, as farm management economists, we definitely advocate for.
I advocate for it too. It's always good to manage risk. But thank you both for coming on today. And
yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun. Sorry you had to come get the JV team.
Thank you again for listening to the Maryland Risk Management Education Podcast. I have put down in the show notes contact information for both Charlie and Justin. So if you have specific questions, you can reach out to them. My contact info is down there as well. Please let me know if you have ideas for future episodes. It's really good when people reach out to me and give me ideas. I'm trying always to come up with new content for this thing, and it's helpful to have ideas from you guys. So thank you again for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.